Hello everyone, my name is Luke Stevens. Welcome back to another edition of the Ghost of Tsushima Ultimate Critique in 4 parts. We'll come up with a catchier title. Work in progress. Last week we covered the open world design in Ghost of Tsushima. This week we're discussing the combat, stealth, and the mechanics contained therein. Next week we'll talk about the narrative, and the week following we're going to be talking about the DLC and the overarching legacy of Ghost of Tsushima. So make sure to subscribe to get notified of when all of those other parts come out as well. And of course, I'll have part 1 linked in the description box as well. I'm sure it goes without saying, but spoiler alert for everything in the game. We show clips from all throughout the entirety of Ghost of Tsushima. So if you are concerned about that, go play the game, come back to this. It'll be here waiting for you. But with that said, part 2, combat. To introduce the combat, I want to start with a comment made by one of the developers over at Sucker Punch Studios as it pertains to combat within the game, because I think it frames this whole system very, very well. This is coming from Nate Fox of Sucker Punch Studios, and he said, quote, "We have this phrase that we use to describe the combat in the game," that being Ghost of Tsushima, and that's, quote, "mud, blood, and steel," end quote. We want it to feel really, really grounded and lethally precise. If you've ever seen a samurai movie, you know what it's like. These men cut each other down with a single stroke of their sword, and to capture that samurai movie fight is different than a lot of games, because that means you can die very quickly and your enemies can too. And that took us a while to get right, but we're very pleased with the results and we think that it shows well on screen, end quote. And I love this. It's one of those gameplay design elements, specifically with combat, that everybody feels but has trouble putting into words. In effect, what they're talking about here is something called TTK, or time to kill. You hear people talk about it all the time with regards to first-person shooters like Warzone or Apex. It basically just means the time it takes to kill another character, whether that's an NPC or the player character themselves. The balancing of this data point will determine how realistic a game's combat system will feel, how fair violent engagements will feel to the player, and how many mistakes a player can make in a set amount of time before being punished with the kill screen. And setting aside all the fluff and glamour of graphical fidelity, building systems, different shielding and super abilities for characters, one of the key statistical considerations that separates games like Apex from Call of Duty, from Fortnite, from Valorant is this one stat, this time to kill. Something like Valorant has an extremely short time to kill. It just takes one headshot and you're done. Whereas something like Apex requires a much longer engagement, a much higher time to kill, which usually requires a little bit more skill as it pertains to longer gunfights. Not to say that Valorant doesn't take skill, because obviously it does. You have to land a headshot and not a foot shot, but still you get the point. For something like Call of Duty, it has a lower time to kill to encourage aggressive gameplay, which of course leads to higher kill counts for players, which makes them feel better at the game, even though, let's be honest, it's far more impressive to get 10 kills in Apex than it is to get 20 kills in Warzone. In the case of Ghost of Tsushima, the developers were trying to recreate the feeling of these old samurai movies that you may have seen. And it's not just reflected in the combat, it's reflected all over the place, both in the framing of scenes, the cutscenes, the cinematics that play out, and hell, even in just the overarching narrative, which I've been told is very similar to many, many samurai films that have been produced over the last 60 or so years. But to replicate the feeling of those films, it's a lot harder than just saying we want a fast TTK and then implementing that into the gameplay system. To do this well, it has to be short enough for the player and the NPC that it feels like every combat encounter is dangerous, but also slow enough that it allows for mistakes to be made, especially early in the game, and most importantly, it has to be fun. Now, fun is a really tough term for us to define when talking about video games. I've talked about this before because I think a lot of the best video games in history aren't necessarily fun. They may be satisfying, fulfilling, rewarding, or even just time-consuming and mindless, but fun as a term to describe a game is something that only applies to a small subset of games, at least in my opinion. In this case with Ghost of Tsushima, I'm using the term fun kind of loosely. I mean it where it needs to feel as though the engagements are fair, they need to be satisfying, and you need to feel as though you've accomplished something every time you go into a combat encounter and come out victorious. And really at its core, I think the combat system in Ghost of Tsushima depends a lot on the rhythm and pace of combat, which is something that almost turns every encounter into a dance of sorts. It's a rhythmic thing, which is something you'll feel if you've played Sekiro, for instance, from FromSoft and other games from those same developers who have fantastic combat systems. There's a rhythm to it, and when you're feeling it, it almost turns into a musical experience where it's instinctual and muscle memory. It's deep down in you, and it's not as much of a contemplative thing. You just feel when you need to dodge, you feel when you need to parry, so on and so forth. Once again, this is really freaking hard to do. Like, how do you even make a rhythmic musical combat system? Not easy. Not easy. It takes some phenomenal development talent, a lot of refinement, and years of experimentation and messing with the animations and timings of attacks and deflections and everything. All of that said, Ghost of Tsushima nails it. But with that being said, throughout the rest of this video, while we show clips of combat encounters and footage of people fighting with swords, just keep an eye out for this sort of rhythmic combat where you'll see attacks come at a steady pace. It might be, slash from an enemy, and you get the parrying timings just right. I realize I'm moving a lot and it's probably distracting. But just keep an eye on it, because you'll see this all over the place as we show more footage of the game, and now that I've called it out, you won't be able to unsee it. Now, within the combat, there are three basic elements that need to be considered. For one, there's ranged, with the bow and arrow that you have access to, a short bow and a long bow. And then, of course, there's direct man-to-man, hand-to-hand sword fighting combat, which is what the game is mostly known for and where it puts most of its focus. Now, the weapons you can use are pretty straightforward. You have the Sakai Katana and the Tanto, which is just kind of a short sword dagger thing that you'll use in a lot of stealth sections. You have the half bow and a long bow, a bunch of different arrow types that can be used in different instances, which is kind of a cool way to increase variety. You'll have bombs, kunai, wind chimes, firecrackers, and even a blowgun that you get much later in the game. All of these tools generally focus towards variability within the combat, but they're all just set dressing around the core combat mechanics, which are centered around the longbow, short bow, the katana, and the tanto. You have to master those four, and then these other things kind of get sprinkled in. You might be fighting with your katana, and then there's a big horde of enemies coming at you, so you throw down a bomb to escape, get some space, or maybe stun them so you can clear a couple. Those types of things come in after you've mastered the base combat. And the thing that really impresses me about all of these smaller tools, like the wind chimes, firecrackers, kunai, the blowgun, all of these things, is that you'll be using all of them by the end of the game. And that is actually pretty impressive. Now, the way this was described to me by somebody that was going through school for game development, I can understand if this doesn't make a lot of sense, but it made sense to me, and I've remembered it all this time, so I'll refer it and communicate it to you now. Basically, how they described it was there are bucket games and there are bin games. Buckets and bins. Some games are what we call bucket games, and in this bucket is just a select few tools that you'll get to use. Maybe the katana, a longbow. You get these things, you'll use them through the whole game, you'll get to know them very, very well, you'll specialize in them, and that's where all of your focus is going to go to. Think of something like Sekiro. That's what that game is. It's a bucket game. There's a bunch of sort of tangential little tools that you can use to affect these basic overarching tools, but at the end of the day, it's about the small selection of weapons given to the player. A bin game would be one where there's a gigantic bin. Think of how they use it like in the UK, a big bin of stuff that you can use. Tons of different options as far as gameplay is concerned. Think of Elden Ring, think of Monster Hunter World. These kinds of games where there's tons of different tools and approaches, play styles, everything is up to the player. You can engage with some of them, all of them, it's up to you. So there's a bucket game and a bin game. They're two different things. Both are fine. Both can be phenomenal in their own right. They're just different. In the case of Ghost of Tsushima, we're dealing with a bucket game. There's a couple of core tools that you need to use and a bunch of other stuff sprinkled in, but for the most part, you can get through the entire game without having to mess with them if you don't want to at all. But the way they've designed the combat encounters and the encampments and all of the later game missions, especially once they start encouraging you to engage in more stealthy approaches to these combat encounters, you'll find yourself using all of these tools, the kunai, the blowgun, the wind chimes, the firecrackers, all of them very intentionally, and you'll be exhausting them every time you go through a camp in a good way because you're using all of the tools given to you. Whereas in the case of something like Sekiro, a lot of people will go through the majority of that game without messing around with a lot of the smaller tools that are given to the player because frankly, the game wasn't designed with that intention. You don't need to engage with those. Sure, they can make bosses cheesy, but in general, you don't need to engage with them if you don't want to. Ghost of Tsushima designs the quests brilliantly so that you start using these tools without even realizing that you're being pushed into using them. And like I said, I think this is mostly because the game swaps between these two basic approaches to gameplay that they encourage you to engage with. There's the ghost option, and then there's the samurai option. They both have narrative implications. They both have characters which are encouraging the player to use one over the other. But it basically just comes down to one is all about stealth and going the ghostly route, and the other option is to do the high honor sort of stereotypical samurai approach to combat where you face your opponents head on and whoever is the stronger fighter comes out on top. There's no right way or wrong way to play the game. It is actually up to you. But by the end of the game, regardless of which one you prefer, the narrative will start to push Jin into situations where he has to use stealth. And there's even narrative moments later on in the game which are based on these stealthy choices, such as the time when you have to poison the Mongol encampment in order to clear it out so that you can progress up towards where the Mongol leader is currently stationed, at least at that point in the game. I'd say for probably 3/4 of the main story, it's up to the player as to which side they want to land on. If they want to go mostly stealth and ranged, or if they want to go right up in the faces and get in there and get dirty. It's up to the player for most of that, but towards the end of the game, you're going to be forced into using a lot more stealth than direct confrontation. So by the end of the game, most players will have the skill trees fully branched out. You won't have anything left to apply, and most players will be very well versed in both. Now, it should also be noted that almost every single one of these weapons can be upgraded beyond their initial starting point, such as the katana and the tanto, which can be upgraded to increase damage output, reduce noise generated when they're in use, or even change the animations which are used during executions, which is a cool touch. You'll do this with a bunch of supplies and iron that you discover as you explore the world. It's not actually that transformational. Basically, it'll increase your DPS or damage per second that you can put out, which allows you to kill grunts much quicker in case you need to travel to early game areas, and it makes you feel like you're becoming more powerful as you play through the game. And it also makes it easier to kill brutes, at least on paper, but in effect, this usually just means it takes 7 cuts to kill a brute instead of 8 that it did right before that. Sure, over the course of the entire game, it might go from 16 hits directly to a brute to kill them down to 6 or 7 by the end of the game, but it's so incremental as you go through, it doesn't feel like there's major progress being made every time you upgrade the weapon. It was a little bit of a letdown every time I would go spend all of these resources, upgrade my katana, only to see that there wasn't really at least a major noticeable effect on my next combat encounter. But it was small enough that maybe it's not a big deal to you. But for me, it was something I noticed, or perhaps I should clarify, didn't notice. Rather, for major gameplay shifts, you need to look at the armor and what you're wearing there to see major changes come into play. And so I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about armor and the different options that are in the game. There's a bunch of different armor sets that you can discover as you go through the story of Ghost of Tsushima and while you're exploring. Some of them are more hidden than others. Some of them require you to clear multiple camps filled with Mongol invaders before you can even get the chance to unlock it. So it really does come down to what you want. If you want to just go through the game with some basic armor sets, you can do that. But if you want to specialize, whether it be stealth or direct confrontation, you can do that by seeking out these specific armor types. Each armor set has 3 basic perks that help you increase the stats related to your preferred playstyle, even encounter to encounter, because of course you can change armor sets in between fights whenever you want, which is a great option for difficult encounters. And I can't talk this up enough. Really, it's important that you're able to swap armor loadouts so quickly and easily. It's fantastic. Because the armor and charms are mostly what affects your combat experience and your abilities, whether it's increased damage output, damage resistance to ranged attacks, or anything else, it's very important, depending on which camp you're dealing with, that you swap to the armor which is best suited for that particular encounter. And they make it very, very easy to do this in the menus, thankfully, because it allows you to specialize encounter to encounter, which makes me feel as the player much more rewarded for taking the time to seek out these different armor sets. It's a great touch. I love that they do this. I wish more games that had different armor sets made it this easy to create loadouts and stuff. It's one of my favorite things from Monster Hunter World, for example, where you can build loadouts specific for certain types of min-maxed specialties. And the fact that they do it here, though albeit in a much more simplified and streamlined way, is great to see. Based on my notes I took while I was playing the game, there are also perks that increase defense and damage reduction, stealth and melee damage, and even heavy armor sets can increase the amount of damage you can receive and heavily reduce the damage received also from arrows and ranged attacks specifically, making it so you can really specialize based on which armor set you have equipped. Furthermore, all of these armor sets can be upgraded beyond their initial starting level, and these not only have stat bonuses once they're leveled up, which are not as noticeable as you might expect, though certainly in effect and real, they also have visual representations. So when you discover an armor set, it might initially look kinda lame, but as you level it up, it'll get better and better and better and better, which again encourages the player to do it as they play through the game. Little touches like that are great. So many games have armor sets that you can upgrade, level up, and make better, but there's no visual representation of it, so it's just kind of like throwing XP and supplies into the wind, and you're just hoping and praying that it has some noticeable gameplay effect. But in this case, upgrading these armor sets, even if there's no noticeable gameplay impact, is worth it just because the visual improvement is so significant. And I feel like I should know my favorite armor set, even though it doesn't actually offer like any armor whatsoever. It's my favorite not because of its looks, but for its use. It's the Traveler set, which once fully upgraded, greatly increases the range that's cleared on the map as you explore the island so that the map becomes much more useful. It also increases your ability to discover certain things, especially like guiding winds have bigger range, which allows you to find more things as you explore. It's great. Like the fact that there's an armor set specifically tailored for just exploring the world is fantastic. Why don't more games have this? Like if you're gonna be exploring the game's world, why not have an armor set and a build out, a whole loadout for your character that's just for exploring and finding new things? Like, sure, some games and many games that have great open worlds, even Elden Ring, for example, has abilities and certain pendants and things that can increase discoverability of certain items or increase payout of XP or whatever the given currency in the game may be. But for this, it was just so streamlined and well done. It not just had an impact on the map that you could clearly see every time you pulled it up, but also just as you explored, being able to notice and discover more things around you or higher supply payouts when you discovered it out in the world. It was just great to see. It's very well implemented here, very streamlined, very well done. Now, as for the Minutiae of Combat, let's see, you've got your great armor set all equipped. You've got your charms loaded up, which are exactly in line with your playstyle. You've got your weapons fully upgraded and you're ready to go. What does combat actually look like? Well, it's sort of similar to how Neo worked, where there's 4 basic stances that you can choose between, and each of them have a specialty tied to them. The stone stance is the one you start the game with and is very, very simple and is basically used for fighting grunts and just general damage. The water stance is used against people that have shields. It's great for breaking shields and is received after you're killing roughly 3 different Mongol leaders, at least according to my count. The wind stance is available to the player after killing another 5 Mongol leaders at camps, or at least discovering them. I saw some people on Reddit say you only have to discover Mongol leaders and encampments to get access to the stance. Other people said you have to actually kill them. I'm not sure which it is. If you know, let me know in the comment section below. And this wind stance is used for people with spears, halberds, and the like. And lastly, the moon stance is the last one you'll receive, probably 2/3 of the way through the game. And this thing is available to the player after 7 more leaders have been killed, discovered, whatever it is. And this stance is specifically for the big brutes that have lots and lots of poise. They're not easy to stagger. This stance makes it extremely easy to do it with a special spin move that you can use. It's super cool to see. Furthermore, each of these stances can be upgraded using experience points and help the player become more specialized given which stance they prefer to use. Going back to the idea of the bucket or bin game, you're not really going to specialize in one stance over the other, at least for the majority of the game. Especially by the end, you will have almost every single one, if not every single one of these stances fully leveled out. So they're performing in the optimal way. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a little pet peeve of mine for so many games to come out and just like give you a skill tree and pretend as though they're giving the player options and agency, when in reality, by the end of the game, everybody will be in the exact same place as everybody else. It's like, not every game has to be an action RPG. It's okay if your game isn't an action RPG. There's no issue there. Like, don't pretend as though it's something that it's not. So with this, I mean, I think they could have achieved the same exact thing if every time Jin leveled up or discovered another set of techniques that he could use, if you just tweaked it so the stances also became more powerful, that would achieve the exact same thing as these weird branches that they give you. It's just kind of filler. It's fluff. Not a bad thing, just a pet peeve of mine. Now, all of these stances can be quickly swapped between during combat, and so you'll find yourself as you are approached by a group of 2 to 3 mercenaries. Maybe one of them has a shield, one of them has a spear, and the other just has a regular sword, swapping to the relevant stance that you need to deal with each individual opponent. And it makes combat feel extremely fluid. Unfortunately, though, it's not really implemented in the most comprehensive way. What I mean is that, for example, mini bosses and bosses don't usually require you to use multiple stances in a single phase. For example, one boss fight may have the boss begin with one weapon set, maybe it's a sword and a shield. So you'll use a lot of the water stance while fighting him. The next phase will swap and he'll have a halberd and you'll need to deal with him there. And so you swap stances and play most of that phase with that stance, if not entirely with that stance, through the entire phase of the fight. So it swaps it up, but only on a phase-to-phase basis, whereas I think more stance swapping would have been much more interesting. And it is important to note that the developers seem to agree with this criticism as well, because the DLC introduces a whole new set of enemies that do just that and require you to swap stances multiple times while dealing with just that one enemy. So it seems as though even the developers agree with this point. In the base game, everybody's just specialized and you have one stance for one enemy pretty much exclusively, and then you swap stances to deal with the other enemy. Or big bosses, it's on a phase-to-phase fight. DLC totally shakes it up. But don't worry, we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. Now, these stances initially seem extremely complicated and intimidating, even difficult to master, but towards the end of the game, it really will become second nature. You'll see a pikeman, you'll switch to the wind stance until he's taken care of, and then you'll see a shield-wielding swordsman, so you'll swap to water stance until he's taken care of. It really is fluid, and it will become muscle memory quicker than you might expect. And all of these tied together with ease, with the jumping attacks, throwing bombs to stun enemies to quickly get in there and take somebody out with a knockdown or a finisher. All of it just works so well and integrates so well. It's got to be one of the most cohesive combat systems of any game in the last few years. It really is impressive. Now, I've referenced charms a few times over the course of the last few minutes of the critique, and I feel like I should give them a little bit more time in the spotlight because they do have a much more noticeable impact than I think many other systems in Ghost of Tsushima do. Now, these charms are just little items that you can discover while exploring the world, completing side quests, or honoring shrines. Honoring shrines being the main way that you retrieve them. And each of these has a special ability that can be used and applied to the player character that have different effects. So for example, one major charm might be able to restore a set amount of health or resolve once you execute an enemy, or it could make it so you deal more stagger, or it greatly increases ranged damage, or it reduces the amount of sound you make when crouched and walking. All of these different effects that allow you to specialize your Jin at least a little bit. And towards the end of the game, I found myself creating loadouts for my particular playstyle, which tended to be very bombastic. Get in there, get up close and personal, wipe as many people as you can. And that required me to have all sorts of charms and armor sets laid out in a way that increased maximal damage output and also reduced physical damage received from melee attacks. I wasn't that protected against ranged attacks, which was the one fault of it, but in general, I would take those people out first with my longbow and then get into the camp and deal with everybody up close and personal there. However, like I said, later in the game, they will force you into situations where you need to engage in stealth. So for that, I used charms that I had, which increased the amount of stealth damage I could do, or made it so every time I stealth killed somebody, I would receive health back or increase my resolve. All of these different things that greatly ease the process of combat, especially if you happen to be discovered while engaging in stealth through a particular encampment. It's done very, very well. My only wish would be that these charms did more and there were more options to customize them. Most of the time, you're only talking about 3 or 4 charms that are of any real use for hours and hours on end of gameplay. There's not a lot of reason to experiment a lot because their effects are pretty straightforward. It may be like, oh, this charm increases the damage I deal out. This charm increases the damage that I can receive before it actually affects my health. Cool. I'm going to apply these and we'll call it good. And that's it. You'll keep those charms for a while. There's not a lot of reason to quickly swap them or to experiment with different options and combinations. But I mean, once again, this is something that probably is just a limitation of the total gameplay loop that we're dealing with. There's not a lot of reason to swap them unless the mission that you're engaged with forces you into the position where you'll need to change it and experiment with it, such as swapping from a direct confrontation mission to a stealth mission or an exploration-based mission, which requires you to change out all the different charms that you may have equipped to ones that help with discovery of new objects or sights and scenes. So it's a small criticism because I am sure most people don't notice or care particularly. They just use the charms that feel good. But these things are fun. These things are cool. You discover them. They encourage you to explore the island while you're going about your business and take the extra time to honor the shrines that you can earn these charms that the foxes lead you to. I just wish there were more reason to find more of them, and there were more wacky combinations, wacky things that you could do with them. Now, speaking of stealth, this is mostly used in dedicated missions, as I've referenced repeatedly over the last half hour or so. It's not a bad deal. It's not a bad thing. These stealth missions usually feel pretty fair, such as this example where you have to sneak through a Mongol camp into a besieged village as part of the main story. it's well done. Well done enough. But there is one major flaw in Ghost of Tsushima that we haven't really talked about, and it's because you don't see it in direct confrontations in combat, because you're just getting up close and personal with people, and it doesn't put much of a strain on the enemy AI. But stealth is where AI is extremely important, and it's just not very good. Now, there are many things that this game does to make it feel like the world is alive and real, but the second that things get out of strictly scripted sequences as part of the main story quest, for example, we just see the whole thing fall on its face. For example, enemies do everything to get to you. Full stop. Like, they will even chase you off of a cliff if it means that they will get from point A to point B. Point A being their starting point, point B being wherever you happen to be. It's amazing. Like, honestly amazing. Now, the devs have actually referenced the AI and issues that were present at the game's launch and even within the director's cut. And apparently the game's AI was greatly improved after launch in the months that followed through patches and improvements that they made. But even still, in the director's cut, the version that I played for this video or series of videos, the AI is still pretty damn stupid. So if they can find any way to improve this in the next game or entry, I think it'll be very much appreciated. Now, there's a lot here that just makes me think that the devs were overly reliant on the fact that most players will simply rush into enemies and wipe them before noticing how dumb they actually are. But this is where AI comes in stealthy moments and levels where the devs don't specifically tweak the AI to account for different styles or approaches that the player may take. For example, the Mongols don't hear their friends getting headshotted with a longbow just meters away from them. They give up trying to find you after only a minute or two. In most cases, I timed it out to almost exactly 60 seconds on any given occasion, which makes me think that the devs did just that. They set a 60-second timer from when the character disappears to when the Mongols give up and just go back to their resting position. I get it, that's a simple way to code this type of thing, but it's not realistic. It sticks out like a sore thumb. If there's some sort of dynamic system where perhaps the player leaves behind a trail, or if it was a big enough distraction like somebody was killed, they never go back to their placid state where they are neutral. They stay on alert, keep patrolling until they find this person that killed someone. Like, little things like that just pull you out affect the overall stealth system in a pretty significant way. If I'm going through an encampment and I know that I can just quickly assassinate somebody, hide behind this wall for 60 seconds, and then go back out and continue doing my thing, it makes me not take these encounters very seriously. Whereas in direct combat confrontations, I need to take it seriously because that TTK is low enough that the damage dealt from enemies is a real problem and a real concern. It's one of the unfortunate things in Ghost of Tsushima is that they nail the feeling of the high stakes combat in direct sword fighting. But when it comes to stealth, those stakes are completely gone. And that concern or realism, grit, groundedness, whatever you want to call it, is just missing. Furthermore, the Mongols don't have any sort of schedules or activities that keep them moving throughout the camp in any sort of realistic way beyond basic patrols. They may be sitting at a campfire, fishing, or sleeping in a stable, but they don't actually do anything that makes them look like real people that aren't just plopped in individual areas within a camp. Now, other games have managed this, even other games that don't actually have any significant stealth system whatsoever, like Assassin's Creed. Sorry, was that mean? That might have been a little mean. I'm sorry. I'm a fan of Assassin's Creed. I got the statues, Ivor's right there. I like Assassin's Creed, but come on, we got to be real with ourselves. Specifically, I mean Assassin's Creed Origins. They made a big hullabaloo about the AI in that game, and it actually is really impressive. If you assassinate an NPC in Assassin's Creed Origins, the guards will come, discover the body, look for you for about 5 minutes or so. It's a while, and then they'll pick up the body and take them and put them in a secluded area within the camp that they're hanging out in or the ruins that they are, and they'll set all of the bodies in a pile over in that one location so that they can be buried later. Little things like that are so cool to see. Like, oh, well, we found a body. We got to clear it. Okay, I'll take him back to the corner and we'll come pick him up later. Okay, we'll take him over there. And then they go to sleep. They're on patrols. They rotate. One guard, if you follow them around the map, will be on patrol. And then after their shift ends, they'll go back down. Another guard will replace them and they'll go sleep in the barracks that are set up in that same encampment. Way more impressive than what's going on here. And that's something that could be easily, or I guess easily might be a little aggressive, that could definitely be improved in whatever sequel comes to Ghost of Tsushima. Better AI would be greatly appreciated and would help all of this feel grounded, not just in the individual swordplay encounters, but also in the stealth. Now, all of this to say, combat is really tight. It feels fair, and by the end of the game, you'll feel like an expert, and you likely will be. You'll be swapping stances, bows, dodging between enemies like it's nothing. And I don't really know how they managed this to work so fluidly, but the developers somehow managed to introduce all of these systems slowly and methodically enough that it never really felt contrived or frustrating. I never felt like I was training or practicing a new system, but instead I just looked up every once in a while and realized that I was making a bunch of progress. And I think it's probably that they managed to slowly introduce more and more enemies that challenge whatever new ability you just unlocked at a pace which feels very natural. But regardless, it's very impressive. Even great games struggle with this and can lead players to feeling like they have to intentionally train themselves into using a new ability, like when new players have to learn how to parry Father Gascon in Bloodborne. You basically can't beat the boss without learning how to do this, and it takes a lot of practice, so you'll spend an hour or two getting the timings down on the smaller enemies throughout the level in order to prepare for that big encounter. It's not a bad thing, obviously, but I think it's exceptionally impressive when a game has a complicated set of systems and they manage to teach the player how to use them without the player feeling as though they're learning how to use those systems. But speaking of learning how to use and engage with different systems, I think this brings us to the most important discussion of this part of the critique, which is balance and repetition, because there are concerns, and some would even say problems. You see, a lot of people compared this game to Far Cry mixed with Assassin's Creed, and I think that's fairly accurate as a summation of what the game is trying to do with its gameplay. It has basic fortresses and outposts that you have to liberate, and there are stealth missions, which, I know it's hard to believe, used to be very prevalent in Assassin's Creed. Now, don't get it twisted, this game does a lot of stuff much better than either of those two franchises, and it melds the two ideas very, very well. However, one of the things that it shares with these games is the extreme repetition that can be felt after 10 to 20 hours of gameplay. There are only so many camps that you can liberate, so many times that you can defeat the same enemies, and only so many times that you can write small haikus before it begins to feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again. Because, to be honest, you are. This is why a discussion of pace is really important to highlight. A game can be repetitious so long as it doesn't overstay its welcome. The problem usually arises when a game is incredibly repetitive but acts as though its systems can sustain dozens upon dozens of hours of repeated engagement. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for example, has a pretty robust gameplay loop, but the problem is the game doesn't end after 20 to 30 hours like Ghost of Tsushima does. Instead, it hangs out for over 100 hours. And even once we get to the DLC, the same content is repeated, proving that they never learned their lesson from the base game. All of this to say, thankfully, Ghost of Tsushima doesn't overstay its welcome. Yes, it's repetitive. Yes, you'll be doing the same thing a lot. Thankfully, that thing you're doing repeatedly is very refined and very high quality and enjoyable. But the key takeaway for developers that are looking at Ghost of Tsushima as inspiration is that it didn't try to be a 100-hour epic experience like Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It knew what it was doing, it knew what it did well, and it knew when it was time to end it. And that's okay. It's okay for a game to be lean and mean and only 20 hours long. That's okay. Every game doesn't have to be this huge, epic, 5-act experience. It's okay. Keep it lean. I will say now that after playing through the whole game and the DLC, I feel as though I've reached a good stopping point with Ghost of Tsushima. I don't feel the need to play anymore. Most combat encounters feel dry and similar to others, and it just isn't pushing me to go and continue exploring and platinuming the island. And this, again, isn't a bad thing in my view. Everything is integrated so well, I don't feel as though there were any major missed opportunities or anything like that. They did their job. And impressively, they even introduced new systems, which are super cool and interesting, that flip some gameplay systems on its head in the DLC, which again, we'll discuss in part 4. So while I agree the game is definitely repetitive, I think they struck gold and they stuck on it. And that's awesome. I think they struck gold and stuck on that vein until it was drained, and then they stopped digging, which is what every developer should be trying to do. Figure out what works, follow it through to the end of its natural life, and then call it good. But don't get me wrong, the game isn't nothing but repetition. There is a little variability here. For example, the game does introduce small spikes of interest and challenge with these mini boss fights, for example, that are scattered throughout the map. They're fun, offer a nice little challenge and a break from exploration, and I always was excited when I came across one. My only critique of these would be that I'd like to see more, and I'd like to see more varied combat encounters. Yes, it's cool that we can engage in a much more high-stakes sword fight, but I would like a boss that maybe comes in and plays really dirty, throws dirt in your eyes, or pulls out a weapon you haven't seen before. Just something that shakes it up a little bit more. Because while these do break the repetitious cycle of exploration, finding a camp, clearing the camp, etc., at its core, it is more repetition. Because most of these mini-boss encounters are just going to be identical to the other mini-boss encounters that you dealt with previously. All told, the combat and the engagements with NPCs and enemies in Ghost of Tsushima is done extremely well, implemented well, it's polished, it's refined, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, which is so wonderfully refreshing. I've played so many games in the last 2 years that just are trying so hard to offer value to the player by giving them dozens upon dozens upon dozens of hours of content, even though that content is just the same thing over and over and over again. It's so nice to have a game that offers you a platter, you finish the platter, and you're full, and that's it. That's the whole meal. They don't pretend as though everything needs to be a buffet. They just tell you that this is what we got. Enjoy it. You enjoy it? Cool. See you next time. I know, it's weird, it's refreshing. Rewind the clocks 5 years, I'm sure we would be like, I wish Ghost of Tsushima were longer, I need more content. But right now, at this time and place in the industry, it's really refreshing to have a lean, mean experience, and Ghost of Tsushima offers it. It's not perfect, but what is here is done very, very well. Small improvements that could be made here and there, but the biggest among them is the AI definitely needs an upgrade before the sequel comes out. Unfortunately, while the DLC does introduce some new ideas, doesn't introduce any improved AI, so we're stuck with that through the entirety of Ghost of Tsushima. But all told, it's fantastic. It's freaking fantastic. But now we need to discuss the narrative, but not until next week. Thank you for watching. I love all of you more than you could possibly know. If you have any thoughts on the combat system of Ghost of Tsushima, let me know in the comment section below. And also, if you're enjoying this part-by-part breakdown of Ghost of Tsushima, let me know in the comment section below as well, because in the past, we've just done these videos as big, like 3-hour-long critiques. So breaking it up into multiple parts is a little different for me. I would greatly appreciate your feedback. Follow all of my socials. Follow me on Twitch. We probably are streaming at the exact moment that this video goes live. So if you're watching it, just got done with it, pop over to the stream and say hi. I'd love to see you. But that's it for me. Thank you for watching. I love you all very, very much. I'll see you in the next video. I appreciate you. Bye-bye.